Imagine a boy with no money, no connections, and less than 2 years of formal schooling. A runaway apprentice arriving in a strange city with nothing but 3 oversized bread rolls and a desperate hope for something better. Now imagine that same boy growing into a man who would tame lightning from the sky, charm the kings of Europe, help birth a nation, and change the course of human history. This is not a fairy tale. This is the true story of Benjamin Franklin, a printer's apprentice who taught himself to become a scientist, inventor, writer, diplomat, and founding father. His face watches over every $100 bill, but his real legacy is far more valuable than any currency. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, let me tell you how one man proved that in America, you could transform yourself into anything you dared to dream. Before we begin this journey through time, if you enjoy falling asleep to stories from history told in this calm, immersive way, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing you these peaceful journeys into the past, and it lets us know you'd like to hear more stories like this one. We are traveling backward through the centuries, beyond the glow of electric lights, beyond the hum of machinery, to a world illuminated by candlelight and warmed by wood fires. We begin our story on a cold January morning in Boston, in the year 1706, when the world was a very different place, and when a baby's cry announced the arrival of a boy who would help create a new one. Imagine, if you will, a narrow wooden house on Milk Street in Boston, its timbers dark with age and weather. Snow dusts the cobblestones outside, and smoke rises from chimneys all along the street, carrying with it the mingled scents of cooking fires, tallow, and the salt air from the nearby harbor. Inside one particular house, a house that leans slightly as old houses do, crowded with children and the implements of a tradesman's life, a baby cries. It is January 17th, and Josiah Franklin, a candle maker and soap boiler, has just welcomed his 15th child into the world. They name him Benjamin. The 15th child. Not the first, not the treasured only son, but the 15th among 17 children that Josiah Franklin would eventually father. In this crowded household, young Benjamin would have to find his own way, carve his own identity from the raw material of circumstance and will. And this, perhaps, was the first great lesson of his life, that nothing would be given to him, that everything must be earned through cleverness, industry, and the relentless application of his own considerable talents. The Boston of Benjamin's childhood was a town of perhaps 7,000 souls, a place where everyone knew everyone, where the Puritan faith still held its stern grip on daily life, where the stocks and pillory stood ready in the town square for those who transgressed. The streets were unpaved, muddy in spring, dusty in summer, frozen in winter. Pigs rooted in the alleys. The town crier called out the hours. Church bells marked the rhythms of the week, summoning the faithful to services that could last for hours, the preacher's voice rising and falling like waves against the shore of eternity. Young Benjamin's father, Josiah, had emigrated from England in 1683, seeking religious freedom in the New World. He was a practical man, skilled with his hands, capable of supporting his enormous family through the manufacture of candles and soap. Picture him in his workshop, the tallow bubbling in great kettles, the smell thick and greasy in the air, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he dipped wicks again and again into the molten fat, building up layers, creating the candles that would light the homes and churches of Boston. The workshop was a place of transformation, where animal fat became light, where the raw materials of slaughter were refined into something that brought illumination to dark rooms and long winter nights. The process was ancient, unchanged for centuries. The tallow had to be heated to just the right temperature, not so hot that it smoked and burned, not so cool that it refused to coat the wick properly. Josiah had learned these things through years of practice, through the accumulated wisdom of his trade. Young Benjamin would watch his father work, seeing the concentration in the older man's face, the economy of movement, the pride of craftsmanship. But even as a boy, Benjamin understood that this was honest work, necessary work, but it was not the path that would lead to wealth or prominence. Candle making was a trade, respectable but limiting, a way to feed a family but not to change the world. For young Benjamin, watching his father work, there must have been a recognition, even at a tender age, that the world offered more than this. The boy was bright, extraordinarily bright, and everyone could see it. He learned to read almost before he could properly walk, devouring any book that came into his hands. In that time, books were precious objects, expensive and rare. A household might own only a Bible, perhaps a prayer book, maybe a volume of sermons. But Benjamin read everything he could find, his young mind soaking up words and ideas like a sponge absorbs water. His father, recognizing this unusual aptitude, briefly entertained the idea of dedicating Benjamin to the church. Imagine that alternative history, a world in which Benjamin Franklin became Reverend Franklin, spending his days parsing scripture instead of parsing the mysteries of electricity, his voice raised in prayer instead of in the halls of Parliament and palace. But the practical Josiah quickly calculated the cost of clerical education and decided it was beyond his means. Benjamin's formal schooling would last less than 2 years. 2 years. Less than 2 years of formal education for a man who would one day stand before kings, who would help draft the founding documents of a nation, who would unlock secrets of nature that had eluded humanity since the dawn of time. This was the beginning of Benjamin Franklin's education in self-invention, in the understanding that learning happens not in classrooms but in the hungry, curious mind that refuses to be satisfied with ignorance. At 10 years old, Benjamin was pulled from school to work full-time in his father's shop, cutting wicks, filling molds, attending to the kettles of bubbling tallow. He hated it. The work was monotonous, the smell nauseating, the prospects dim. He dreamed of the sea, of adventure, of escape from the narrow confines of his father's trade. Boston was a port city after all, and young Benjamin would watch the ships come and go, their sails billowing, their holds filled with goods from distant lands. His older brother Josiah had gone to sea and never returned, and perhaps this is what stayed Benjamin's hand, what kept him from running away to a life on the water. Instead, his father proposed a compromise. Benjamin could apprentice with his older brother James, who had recently returned from England with a printing press and the ambition to establish a newspaper. At 12 years old, Benjamin Franklin signed an indenture that bound him to his brother until he turned 21. He would work without wages, learning the printer's trade, sleeping in the print shop, his hands black with ink, his days measured by the rhythm of the press. And here we arrive at one of the great ironies of Franklin's life. The printing press, which his brother intended as a tool of commerce, would become for Benjamin an instrument of liberation. In the print shop, surrounded by books, newspapers and pamphlets, the young apprentice found a university more valuable than Harvard or Yale. He read voraciously late into the night by candlelight, teaching himself about philosophy, science, literature and politics. Picture him there in the dim light, the print shop quiet after the day's work, the smell of ink and paper filling his nostrils, a book open before him. Perhaps it is Plutarch's Lives, with its tales of ancient heroes and statesmen. Perhaps it is John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, opening doorways in the young man's mind to questions of knowledge and perception. Perhaps it is Cotton Mather's essays To Do Good, which would influence Franklin's entire approach to civic virtue and public service. Whatever the book, young Benjamin reads with total concentration, committing passages to memory, thinking deeply about what he reads, forming his own opinions. But reading was not enough for this restless, ambitious mind. Benjamin wanted to write, to add his own voice to the conversation of ideas. Yet his brother James was dismissive of the young apprentice, treating him, as was common in that era, more like a servant than a collaborator. So Benjamin devised a scheme, a deception that reveals much about his character, both admirable and otherwise. He began writing letters to his brother's newspaper, the New England Courant, under the pseudonym Silence Dogood. He would write these letters at night, disguising his handwriting, and slip them under the door of the print shop before dawn. Mrs. Silence Dogood presented herself as a widow of a country minister, witty and opinionated, commenting on everything from women's fashion to drunkenness to Harvard College, which she skewered with sharp humor. The letters were a sensation. The people of Boston eagerly awaited each new installment from this clever widow. James Franklin and his circle of friends would discuss the letters, speculate about the identity of their author, praise the writing. And all the while, 16-year-old Benjamin would stand at his press, setting the type for his own words, smiling to himself at the secret he held. When he finally revealed himself as the author, did he expect praise? Recognition? Perhaps. Instead, his brother was angry, jealous perhaps of his young apprentice's talent. The relationship between the brothers, never warm, deteriorated further. James would beat Benjamin, and the young man began to chafe more bitterly at the bonds of his apprenticeship. Here we find a teenage boy, legally bound to years more service, beaten by his brother, living in a confined space in a small town where everyone knows everyone and secrets are hard to keep. What would you do? What would any of us do? Benjamin Franklin made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He decided to run away, to break his legal indenture, to become, in the eyes of the law, a fugitive. The journey from Boston to Philadelphia in 1723 was not a simple matter of buying a ticket and boarding a train. There were no trains, of course, no highways, no infrastructure as we know it today. Benjamin Franklin, 17 years old, carrying all his worldly possessions in a small bag, had to make his way by a combination of boat and foot, traveling through wild country, sleeping where he could, eating when he could afford to. He arrived in Philadelphia on a Sunday morning in October, exhausted, dirty, hungry, with only a single Dutch dollar in his pocket and some copper coins. The journey had been arduous, taking him by boat from Boston to New York, then overland through New Jersey, parts of the journey on foot, sleeping in barns when he could, under trees when he could not. He had been robbed of some of his small store of money, had been caught in storms, had gone hungry more than once. Picture him as he walked up from the wharf on Market Street, the morning sun catching the water of the Delaware River, gulls calling overhead, the smell of salt and fish and tar from the docks. The city before him was smaller than Boston but had a different feel, more open, less constrained by Puritan severity. The streets were laid out in a grid, William Penn's rational plan imposed on the landscape, unlike Boston's tangle of cow paths and ancient routes. His best clothes were packed away in his small bag, and he wore his work clothes, shabby and travel-stained from days of hard travel. His hair was uncombed, his face dirty. He was so hungry that the first thing he did, after walking a few blocks from the waterfront, was to look for food. He spotted a boy carrying bread fresh from the baker and asked where he had bought it. Following the directions, Benjamin found himself at a bakery, its windows fogged with warmth, the incomparable smell of fresh bread filling the air. Not knowing Philadelphia prices and having only the vaguest idea of what kind of bread was available, he asked simply for 3 pennies worth of bread. The baker, perhaps amused by this strange young man with his Boston accent and disheveled appearance, gave him 3 enormous puffy rolls, much larger than the bread Benjamin knew from home, where bread was smaller and denser. And here is one of the most famous images in American history, one that Franklin himself would later recount in his autobiography with self-deprecating humor. The young runaway walking through the streets of Philadelphia with a roll under each arm and eating the third, his pockets stuffed with extra clothes making him look ridiculous and lumpy, walking past the house of the Reed family, where a young woman named Deborah looked out and saw this absurd figure and laughed at him. Little did Deborah Reed know, or Benjamin himself, that she would one day become his wife, that this ridiculous figure trudging through the streets would one day be the most famous resident of Philadelphia, that the city which received him as a penniless runaway would claim him as its greatest son. But on that Sunday morning, none of this was certain. Benjamin Franklin had only his wits, his skills as a printer, and an unshakable belief in his own ability to improve his circumstances. He found work quickly enough. Philadelphia, though smaller than Boston, was growing rapidly, and skilled tradesmen were in demand. He worked for Samuel Keimer, a printer of indifferent skill and uncertain temper, learning more about human nature perhaps than about printing. In Philadelphia, Benjamin began to make connections. This was one of his great talents, one that would serve him throughout his life. The ability to make friends, to identify useful people, to charm and persuade. He joined a debating club called the Junto, a group of young tradesmen and clerks who met to discuss philosophy, morals, and politics. They called themselves the Leather Apron Club, celebrating their status as working men, but their ambitions were anything but humble. The Junto was Benjamin's true university. In those meetings, held in taverns and coffee houses, with pipes and ale and animated conversation, Benjamin Franklin educated himself in the art of persuasion, learned to argue both sides of a question, developed the habit of intellectual humility that would mark his later life. He trained himself never to contradict people directly, never to assert his opinions too dogmatically, but rather to suggest, to inquire, to propose. This was not mere affectation. Benjamin genuinely believed that truth emerged from discussion, from the collision and comparison of different viewpoints. He was forming himself, consciously and deliberately, into a particular kind of person, one suited to succeed in the world he inhabited. This was self-invention of the most profound kind, not merely changing one's circumstances but changing one's character. And his circumstances did change, though not always in the direction he expected. In 1724, the governor of Pennsylvania, Sir William Keith, took an interest in the young printer. Keith proposed that Benjamin should set up his own printing shop, and promised to furnish the letters of credit necessary to purchase equipment from London. Flattered and excited 18-year-old Benjamin sailed for London, dreaming of the independence and success that awaited him. But Governor Keith's promises proved worthless. The letters of credit never materialized. Benjamin found himself stranded in London, one of the largest cities in the world, with no money and no prospects. A lesser man might have despaired, might have found himself adrift in the gin-soaked streets of London, lost among the poor and desperate. But Benjamin Franklin possessed something invaluable: useful skills and the willingness to work. He found employment at Palmer's Printing House, one of the largest in London, where he astonished his fellow workers with his strength and temperance. While the other printers drank beer throughout the day, Benjamin drank only water, earning the nickname the Water American. While they spent their wages on drink and pleasure, he saved his money and bought books. He swam in the Thames for exercise, becoming so skilled that he briefly considered opening a swimming school. London in the 1720s was a wonder and a horror. It was the largest city in Europe, home to more than 500,000 people, a place of extraordinary contrast. Magnificent public buildings and parks existed alongside slums of unimaginable squalor. Coffee houses buzzed with political debate and scientific discussion, while in the streets, pickpockets worked the crowds and the bodies of the hanged swayed from Tyburn's gallows. The smell of coal smoke hung perpetually in the air. The Thames was an open sewer, yet also a highway of commerce, crowded with vessels from around the world. Benjamin drank it all in, this great city with its energy and vice and opportunity. He went to plays at Drury Lane, visited the Royal Society, argued philosophy with deists and freethinkers. He even wrote and published a pamphlet arguing against divine providence, an intellectual exercise that he would later come to regret, calling it one of the errata of his life. Even then, Benjamin was thinking of his life as a text, something that could be revised and corrected, improved through conscious effort. After 18 months in London, Benjamin returned to Philadelphia in 1726, still working for others but now with greater experience and maturity. He was 20 years old, and the city that had first seen him as a ridiculous runaway now recognized him as a skilled craftsman and an interesting mind. He returned to working for Keimer, but both men knew it was temporary. Benjamin had larger ambitions. Within 2 years he would realize them. In 1728, with a partner named Hugh Meredith, whose father put up the capital, Benjamin established his own printing shop. When Meredith later withdrew from the partnership, bought out by Franklin with money lent by friends, Benjamin became the sole proprietor. At 22 years old, he was his own master, no longer an apprentice, no longer an employee, but an independent businessman in a growing city. As a printer, Benjamin proved to be industrious and clever. He understood that success required not just good work but the appearance of good work. He made sure to be seen in the streets pushing a wheelbarrow loaded with paper, demonstrating his industry to potential customers. He avoided taverns and billiard halls, knowing that reputation mattered in a town where everyone watched everyone. He dressed plainly and worked long hours, rising before dawn and working late into the night. But he was not merely industrious, he was innovative. He understood that a printing press could be more than a job shop producing whatever work came through the door. It could be a platform for ideas, a means of shaping public opinion, a tool for improvement. In 1729 he began publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette, which he had purchased from his former employer Keimer. Under Franklin's direction, the Gazette became the most successful newspaper in the colonies, known for its witty writing, its reporting of news both local and international, and its entertaining and improving content. And then, in 1732, came the publication that would make Benjamin Franklin's fortune and spread his fame throughout the colonies, Poor Richard's Almanac. Almanacs were common publications in colonial America, providing calendars, weather predictions, astronomical information, and various bits of useful knowledge. Every printer with ambition published an almanac, hoping to earn steady income from this annual publication. Benjamin Franklin's genius was to take this familiar form and make it something more, a vehicle for wit, wisdom, and what we might call self-improvement. Poor Richard's Almanac introduced itself with the fictional character of Richard Saunders, a poor man who wrote and published an almanac to earn money, much to the displeasure of his wife Bridget, who scolded him for spending time stargazing when he should be earning money by more practical means. From the beginning, Franklin understood the power of persona, of speaking to readers through a character they could recognize and relate to. Poor Richard was not the learned Dr. Franklin but an ordinary man, struggling with the same problems of making a living and keeping a difficult wife happy that many of his readers faced. The first issue appeared in December 1732, for the year 1733. Franklin, writing as Poor Richard, predicted the death of his rival almanac maker, Titan Leeds, at a precise date and time. When Leeds protested that he was very much alive, Poor Richard insisted that the real Leeds must have died and been replaced by an impostor, since the predictions were based on sound astronomical principles. The controversy generated publicity and sales, exactly as Franklin had intended. But it was the proverbs, the pithy sayings scattered throughout the almanac in the margins and around the calendar, that made Poor Richard famous and beloved. These were not all Franklin's original inventions. Many he borrowed and adapted from earlier sources, from Rabelais and La Rochefoucauld, from English proverb collections and classical authors. But Franklin had a genius for selection and revision, for taking an old saying and polishing it until it gleamed with new clarity and wit. Let them wash over you now, these familiar phrases that have become part of the American consciousness, part of the language itself. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. God helps those who help themselves. There are no gains without pains. Well done is better than well said. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. He that lies down with dogs shall rise up with fleas. Keep your eyes wide open before marriage, half shut afterwards. In this world nothing can be said to be certain, except death and taxes. An investment in knowledge pays the best interest. Some of these sayings are witty observations on human nature. Others are practical advice about work and money. Still others offer wisdom about relationships and character. Taken together, they form a kind of secular scripture for a commercial republic, a guide to living well in a world where success depends on industry, thrift, and practical wisdom rather than on birth or favor. These aphorisms became the folk wisdom of a new society, embedded in the culture so deeply that many people quote them without knowing their source, thinking them merely common sense rather than the carefully crafted work of a brilliant writer. They emphasized industry, frugality, self-reliance, and pragmatism, values that resonated with people building new lives in a new land. They were, in a sense, the values of Benjamin Franklin himself, the values that had carried him from poverty and obscurity to prosperity and reputation. For 25 years, Franklin published Poor Richard's Almanac, selling an average of 10,000 copies a year, an enormous circulation for that time. The almanac made him wealthy, but more than that, it made him influential. Through Poor Richard, Benjamin Franklin was teaching the American people how to think about work, money, time, and virtue. But even as he preached industry through Poor Richard, Franklin was practicing something more ambitious, a systematic approach to moral improvement. At 20 years old, he had conceived a plan to achieve moral perfection, and he pursued this plan with characteristic determination and method. He identified 13 virtues that he wished to master: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He created a small book with a page for each virtue, marked with a grid where he could track his progress, marking each day where he failed to live up to the virtue in question. He would focus intensively on one virtue each week, cycling through all 13 in a quarter, completing 4 cycles in a year. Picture him in the quiet of his room after a long day's work, taking out this little book, examining his conscience, making his marks. Here was a man applying the precision of a craftsman to the work of self-improvement, treating his character as he might treat a piece of metal that needed to be shaped and polished. Did he achieve moral perfection? He himself admitted he did not, and in his later years he looked back on this project with gentle self-mockery. He found, he said, that he had more faults than he had imagined, but that he was happier for having attempted the project. And perhaps this is the real lesson of Franklin's scheme of virtue. Not that perfection is achievable, but that the systematic attempt at improvement itself has value. The virtue he found most difficult was order. He wanted a place for everything and everything in its place, a schedule for each hour of the day, a plan for all his activities. But his life was too complex, his interests too varied, his business too demanding. Papers accumulated, projects overlapped, interruptions disturbed his plans. He eventually made his peace with a certain amount of disorder, comparing himself to a man with a speckled axe who decides that a speckled axe is actually preferable to a shiny one because it's more useful. There is a profound humanity in this recognition. Benjamin Franklin, one of the greatest men of his age, struggled with the same problems of organization and discipline that plague us all, and he found a way to accept his imperfections while still striving to improve. We are all works in progress, always improving but never finished. By his early 40s, Franklin had achieved remarkable success. His printing business was prosperous, managed increasingly by partners while he collected his share of the profits. He had married Deborah Reed in 1730, the same young woman who had laughed at him on his first day in Philadelphia. Their marriage was common law rather than formal, complicated by the fact that Deborah's first husband had disappeared, making her legal status uncertain. But they built a life together, raising Franklin's illegitimate son William, and their own children Francis and Sarah. Tragedy touched their lives when Francis, called Frankie, died of smallpox at 4 years old. Franklin would carry the grief of this loss for the rest of his life, and it reinforced his belief in the importance of inoculation against disease, a practice he championed despite public controversy. But even as Franklin built his business and family, his restless mind sought other outlets. He was never a man who could be satisfied with success in a single arena. His curiosity was too broad, his energy too abundant. And so he turned his attention to civic improvement, to science, and to the mysteries of the natural world. Benjamin Franklin looked at Philadelphia and saw not just what it was, but what it could be. This was the essence of his civic vision, the recognition that communities could be improved through organized effort, that private individuals working together could create public goods, that society was not a fixed thing but something that could be shaped and reformed. Consider what Philadelphia lacked in the 1730s. It had no public library, no fire department, no hospital, no academy for education beyond the most basic, no organized system for lighting or paving streets, no police force worth mentioning. These were not inevitable absences but problems waiting for solutions, and Benjamin Franklin made it his business to provide those solutions. In 1731 he founded the Library Company of Philadelphia, the first subscription library in America. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Subscribers would pay an initial fee and annual dues, creating a pool of money that could purchase far more books than any individual could afford. The books would be available to all subscribers, creating a shared intellectual resource for the community. The significance of this in a time when books were expensive luxuries cannot be overstated. A single volume might cost more than a worker earned in a week. Suddenly, a tradesman or clerk could have access to the latest works of science, philosophy, history, and literature. The library company became, in Franklin's words, the mother of all North American subscription libraries, a model that would be copied throughout the colonies and eventually would evolve into the system of free public libraries we know today. But Franklin didn't stop there. In 1736 he organized the Union Fire Company, the first volunteer fire department in Philadelphia. Fire was a constant terror in colonial cities, where buildings were mostly wood and every house had multiple open flames for cooking, heating, and lighting. When a fire started, the usual practice was for neighbors to form a bucket brigade, passing buckets of water from hand to hand, an inefficient method that often failed to save the burning building. Franklin's fire company was different. Members agreed to keep leather buckets and cloth bags ready at all times. When the alarm was raised, they would rush to the fire, some fighting the flames while others salvaged goods from the building, placing them in the bags for protection. The company would hold regular meetings discussing fire prevention techniques, reviewing their equipment, building the bonds of fellowship that would make them work effectively in the chaos of an actual fire. Picture a cold winter night, the alarm bell ringing, Franklin and his fellow volunteers rushing through dark streets, their breath visible in the frigid air, the orange glow of fire reflecting off low-hanging clouds. There is something deeply human in this image, neighbors helping neighbors, men of different trades and stations united in the common cause of protecting their community. In 1743, Franklin proposed the formation of the American Philosophical Society, modeled on the Royal Society of London, to promote useful knowledge in the colonies. In 1749, he published proposals for an academy that would eventually become the University of Pennsylvania. In 1751, he helped establish Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital in the colonies. Each of these institutions began with Franklin identifying a need, writing a proposal, persuading others to join the cause, organizing the effort and ensuring its continuation. He had a genius for practical organization, for turning ideas into institutions. And he understood something profound about human nature. People were more likely to support a project if they felt ownership of it, if it was presented not as Franklin's idea but as a community effort. This is why he so often worked through committees and clubs, why he preferred to let others take public credit, why he presented his ideas tentatively rather than dogmatically. He was, in the best sense, a democratic leader, one who achieved his goals by building consensus and empowering others. This is the weight of Franklin's civic legacy. Every time we use a public library, every time we see firefighters responding to an emergency, every time we benefit from a hospital or university, we are experiencing the ripples of his vision, the idea that private citizens can organize to create public goods, that community improvement is not the sole responsibility of government but something all of us can contribute to. By 1748, at age 42, Franklin had achieved sufficient success that he retired from active management of his printing business. He made an agreement with his partner, David Hall, who would run the business and pay Franklin half the profits for 18 years. This arrangement gave Franklin the financial security he needed to pursue his other interests, particularly his growing fascination with science. Retirement, however, did not mean idleness. For Franklin, it meant freedom to follow his curiosity wherever it led, to read, to experiment, to think, to write, to engage with the world on his own terms. And it was in this period of retirement that Benjamin Franklin would make the discoveries that secured his place not just in American history but in the history of human knowledge. Lightning storms in the 18th century were terrifying events, and rightfully so. Without warning, a bolt of electricity from the heavens could strike a building, killing the inhabitants or setting fire to everything they owned. Church steeples, the tallest structures in most towns, were especially vulnerable, despite being consecrated ground. Or perhaps because they were the tallest structures, lightning showed no respect for sanctity. The nature of lightning was a complete mystery. Some thought it was divine judgment. Others proposed various natural explanations, but no one really knew. It was one of nature's most dramatic phenomena, and it was completely unexplained by the science of the time. Benjamin Franklin, reading about electrical experiments being conducted in Europe, became fascinated by this mysterious force. In the 1740s, electricity was a parlor entertainment, a curiosity. Experimenters could generate static electricity by rubbing glass tubes, could make sparks jump, could create amusing demonstrations where people's hair stood on end or where they received mild shocks. But what electricity actually was, how it worked, what relationship it had to lightning, if any, these were open questions. Franklin began conducting his own experiments in the late 1740s. He received a glass tube from Peter Collinson, a London merchant and member of the Royal Society, and he began to explore the properties of electrical charge. And here we see Franklin's particular genius as a natural philosopher. He combined careful observation with creative theorizing, and he had an extraordinary gift for clear explanation, for making complex phenomena understandable to ordinary readers. He set up a laboratory in his house, clearing space in a back room, gathering equipment, recruiting friends to assist him. The experiments were sometimes dangerous. Once, trying to kill a turkey with an electrical shock for a dinner party, Franklin accidentally shocked himself instead, knocking himself unconscious. When he came to, his first thought was embarrassment at his carelessness. His second was that the shock had been far more powerful than he had expected. He methodically explored the properties of electrical charge, performing experiments, recording results, forming hypotheses, testing them. He noticed that pointed conductors seemed to draw electrical charge more effectively than rounded ones, a discovery that would prove crucial for the lightning rod. He observed that electrical charge could be stored and released, that it traveled along some materials but not others, that it produced light and heat and sound. Franklin's first great contribution to electrical science was theoretical. He proposed that electricity was not two different fluids as many scientists believed, but a single fluid that could be present in excess or deficit. When a body had more than its normal share of this fluid, it was positively charged. When it had less, it was negatively charged. This was the origin of our terms positive and negative in relation to electrical charge. The theory was elegant and simple, and though we now know that electricity is actually the movement of electrons, and that Franklin got the direction of flow backwards, his conceptual framework was remarkably useful. It allowed him to explain and predict electrical phenomena with considerable accuracy. It provided a common language for discussing electricity that other scientists could adopt and build upon. He demonstrated that electrical charge could be stored in what he called a battery, a set of glass plates coated with metal foil that could accumulate charge and then release it all at once. The term battery would later be applied to chemical batteries, but Franklin's electrical battery was the first use of the term. He showed that multiple plates could be connected to store more charge, that the stored energy could be discharged suddenly or slowly, that it followed predictable laws. He methodically compared the properties of lightning and laboratory electricity, compiling a list of similarities. Both created light and sound. Both could melt metals. Both traveled along conductors and were stopped by insulators. Both could kill living things. Both produced the distinctive smell of what we now know as ozone. The similarities were too numerous to be coincidental. Franklin began to suspect, then to believe, and finally to assert that lightning was simply a large-scale electrical phenomenon, that the terrifying bolts from heaven were the same in nature as the modest sparks he could create in his laboratory. And this led him to his most famous experiment, one that has become legendary, though the details are often misunderstood or sensationalized. In June of 1752, Benjamin Franklin flew a kite during a thunderstorm to prove that lightning was electrical in nature. The popular image is of Franklin standing in the open during a violent storm, with lightning striking the kite directly, electricity coursing down the string in dramatic fashion. This is not quite accurate, and if it had happened that way, Franklin would almost certainly have been killed instantly. The experiment was actually more subtle, more carefully designed, and more scientifically rigorous than the legend suggests. Franklin constructed a kite using a large silk handkerchief stretched over a frame of cedar sticks, the kind of construction that could withstand wind and rain. From the top of the kite's frame, he attached a pointed wire about a foot long, positioned to extend upward into the air. The kite was flown on an ordinary hemp string, the kind of string that would conduct electricity when wet from rain. Here was the clever part. At the bottom of the hemp string, Franklin attached a silk ribbon, which would not conduct electricity even when wet. This silk ribbon he held in his hand, keeping it inside a doorway or shed to protect it from the rain. Where the hemp string met the silk ribbon, he tied a metal key, creating a point where electrical charge could accumulate. He waited in the doorway of a shed with his son William, who had helped him prepare the experiment, watching the storm approach. The sky darkened. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain began to fall, first in scattered drops, then in sheets. The hemp string of the kite grew wet, becoming capable of conducting electricity. As the storm clouds passed overhead, the pointed wire on the kite drew electrical charge from the atmosphere, the same way a grounded lightning rod draws charge. This charge traveled down the wet hemp string to the point where it joined the silk ribbon, and there it accumulated around the metal key, unable to travel further down the non-conducting silk. When Franklin brought his knuckle near the key, he saw and felt a spark jump across the gap. It was a small spark, nothing like the massive discharge of an actual lightning bolt, but it was unmistakably the same phenomenon he had observed in his laboratory experiments with electricity. The clouds were charged with electricity. Lightning was an electrical discharge. The mystery was solved. He repeated the experiment several times, drawing sparks from the key, collecting charge in a Leyden jar, an early form of capacitor, performing the same tests on this atmospheric electricity that he had performed on laboratory electricity. The results were identical. The proof was complete. This was the moment when human understanding leapt forward in a fundamental way. For all of recorded history, lightning had been mysterious, often attributed to divine anger or supernatural forces. Now it was understood to be a natural phenomenon, governed by the same laws that governed electricity in the laboratory. The heavens and the earth operated by the same physical principles. Nature was unified, comprehensible, subject to investigation and understanding. Picture Franklin in that doorway, the rain falling around him, the wind whipping his kite in the darkening sky, his son beside him watching with a mixture of excitement and fear, the moment when that first spark jumped from the key to his hand. In that instant, ancient fear became modern science. The mysterious became explicable. The terrifying became manageable. But Franklin was not content merely to understand lightning. He wanted to protect people from it. And so he invented the lightning rod, a pointed metal rod mounted on the highest point of a building and connected by a wire to a metal stake driven deep into the ground. Lightning, following the path of least resistance, would strike the rod rather than the building and be conducted harmlessly into the earth. It was brilliantly simple and it worked. Lightning rods began to appear on buildings throughout the colonies in Europe. For the first time in human history, there was a reliable method to protect structures from lightning strikes. Countless lives and buildings were saved. And here Franklin did something that reveals much about his character. He refused to patent the lightning rod. When asked why he did not secure exclusive rights to his invention, why he did not profit from it, he replied that we should be glad to serve others through our inventions, and that we benefit from the inventions of others throughout our lives. This was not merely noble sentiment. Franklin genuinely believed that knowledge should be shared, that useful inventions should be available to all. Throughout his life, he invented numerous devices, and the story of each invention reveals something about his character, his curiosity, and his commitment to human welfare. Consider his bifocal glasses, invented around 1784 when he was 78 years old and living in Paris. Franklin, like many people as they age, found that he needed one set of glasses for reading and another for seeing distant objects clearly. The constant switching between pairs was annoying, particularly for someone as active and social as Franklin, who might be reading a document one moment and looking across a room at a dinner companion the next. His solution was characteristically practical and elegant. He had a craftsman cut the lenses of both pairs of glasses in half horizontally, then combine them in a single frame, with the reading lens on the bottom half and the distance lens on the top half. By simply moving his eyes up or down, he could switch between near and far vision without changing glasses. This simple innovation has helped millions of people over the centuries, enabling them to see clearly at all distances without the inconvenience of multiple pairs of spectacles. Franklin could have grown rich from a patent on this invention, but he never sought one, preferring that all who needed them could have them made. The Franklin stove, invented around 1742 when he was 36, addressed a problem that plagued every colonial household: how to heat a home efficiently and safely. Colonial homes were heated by open fireplaces, which were profoundly inefficient and dangerous. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney, escaping into the open air. Rooms far from the fireplace remained cold even when the fire blazed hot. Sparks could escape and set fire to the house or to clothing. The fire consumed enormous quantities of wood, a growing problem as forests near cities were cut down and firewood became expensive. Franklin designed an iron stove that sat in the middle of the room, radiating heat in all directions rather than just forward like a fireplace. It had clever baffles and channels that created a longer path for the hot gases, extracting more heat from them before they escaped up the chimney. The design allowed air to circulate around the hot iron, warming it before entering the room. It reduced wood consumption by as much as 3/4 while providing more even, comfortable heat throughout the room. Pennsylvania's governor, impressed by the invention, offered Franklin a patent that would have made him wealthy, as every household in the colonies and eventually every household in the northern parts of America would have wanted one. Franklin refused, writing in his autobiography that, as we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. The stove was improved by others over time, and various modified versions bearing names like the Pennsylvania stove or the Philadelphia stove became common. Today, improved versions are still manufactured, though they no longer bear Franklin's name on any patent, since there never was one. He invented a flexible catheter when his brother John suffered terribly from kidney stones, a common and agonizing ailment in that era. The rigid catheters then in use often caused additional injury as they were forced through the curves of the urinary tract. Franklin designed a catheter made of flexible segments, jointed so that it could navigate the curves more easily and with less pain. His brother found relief, and the design influenced the development of modern flexible catheters that have eased the suffering of countless patients. He invented a long extension arm, a wooden pole with a grasping mechanism at the end, to retrieve books from high shelves in his library. As a man who owned thousands of books and who remained curious and intellectually active into old age, he needed frequent access to volumes stored on shelves too high to reach comfortably. Rather than accepting the inconvenience of a ladder, he invented a tool that extended his reach, allowing him to remain seated while accessing his entire library. He invented swim fins for the hands, having observed in his youth that webbed hands would provide more power in swimming. As a boy in Boston, he had been an exceptional swimmer, and he remained interested in swimming throughout his life. His hand paddles, made of thin boards shaped to fit the hands, increased swimming speed and efficiency, anticipating modern swim fins by more than 2 centuries. He invented the glass harmonica, perhaps his most aesthetically beautiful invention, around 1761. The instrument consisted of glass bowls of different sizes, each tuned to a specific pitch, mounted horizontally on a rotating shaft turned by a foot pedal. The player would touch the spinning glass with wet fingers, producing ethereal, otherworldly tones of surpassing beauty. The sound was pure and haunting, unlike anything produced by other instruments of the time. The harmonica became fashionable in European salons and concert halls. Mozart composed pieces for it. Beethoven wrote music for it. Marie Antoinette took lessons on it. For several decades, it was a popular instrument among the upper classes. Eventually, it fell out of use partly because of unfounded rumors that the sound drove players mad, but mostly because it was difficult to play and maintain. Still, Franklin's invention added a new voice to human music, and modern versions of the harmonica are still played by a small number of enthusiasts. He charted the Gulf Stream, that great river of warm water flowing through the Atlantic Ocean, creating the first scientific map of a major ocean current. As Deputy Postmaster General for the colonies, Franklin noticed that mail ships from England to America took significantly longer than merchant ships, even though the mail packets were faster vessels with more favorable routing priority. Curious about this paradox, Franklin consulted with his cousin Timothy Folger, a Nantucket whaling captain. Folger explained that the whalers had long known of a powerful current, several miles wide, flowing from the Gulf of Mexico along the American coast and then turning eastward across the Atlantic. The whaling ships, whose captains knew these waters intimately through long experience, avoided the current when sailing west to America and used it when sailing east to Europe. The mail ship captains, often British sailors with less experience in American waters and too proud to take advice from colonial fishermen, frequently sailed directly against the current, adding days or even weeks to their crossing. Franklin had Folger draw the current on a chart, then gathered temperature measurements from sea captains and made his own observations during his Atlantic crossings, creating an increasingly detailed and accurate map. He published the chart in 1770, making the information available to all mariners. Sailing times from Europe to America improved as more captains learned to avoid the current or use it as appropriate. This was typical of Franklin's approach. Identify a practical problem, investigate it systematically, share the solution freely. He made observations about meteorology that were far ahead of their time. In 1743 he planned to observe a lunar eclipse from Philadelphia, but a storm moving up the coast obscured the sky. Later, he learned that the eclipse had been clearly visible in Boston, even though the same storm arrived there several hours later. This seemed paradoxical. The wind in Philadelphia during the storm had blown from the northeast, suggesting the storm was coming from that direction, yet the storm had actually come from the southwest and moved northeast against its own winds. Franklin proposed that large storms have a circular or spiral structure, rotating around a center, and that this center moves in a different direction than the surface winds at any given location. He was describing what we now call the circulation of mid-latitude cyclones, and he was essentially correct, though the full understanding of such storms would not be achieved until the development of modern meteorology in the 20th century. He studied population growth, making calculations that showed the American population was doubling every 20 to 25 years, much faster than in Europe where population growth was constrained by limited land and resources. He predicted that within a century or two, the majority of English speakers would live in America rather than Britain, and that the economic and political center of the English-speaking world would shift westward across the Atlantic. This prediction seemed absurd to his contemporaries, but Franklin lived just long enough to see the beginning of its fulfillment, and we who live in the 21st century know how remarkably prescient he was. He conducted experiments on heat absorption, showing that darker colors absorb more heat from sunlight than lighter colors. He demonstrated this by placing squares of cloth of different colors on snow in bright sunlight and observing how quickly each square sank into the melting snow beneath it. Black sank deepest and fastest, white least, with other colors in between according to their darkness. This simple but elegant experiment had practical applications in clothing design, where white in hot climates, dark colors in cold ones, and building construction, white roofs to reduce cooling costs, dark roofs to capture solar heat. He investigated the calming effect of oil on water, a phenomenon known to sailors but not understood. During a voyage, he poured a small amount of oil on the water and watched the waves subside in that area, becoming smooth and glassy. This led him to speculate about the molecular structure of matter, suggesting that oil spreads on water to form an extremely thin layer, perhaps only a single particle thick. His estimate of the thickness of this oil layer, made from the volume of oil in the area it covered, was remarkably close to the actual size of an oil molecule, calculated more than a century later when scientific instruments became precise enough to measure such tiny distances. Franklin's speculation was an early step toward our modern understanding of molecular structure. He designed a phonetic alphabet to make English spelling more logical and easier to learn, creating new letters for sounds not adequately represented in the standard alphabet and eliminating letters like C, J, Q, W, and Y that he considered redundant. Though his alphabet was never adopted, his observations about the illogical and inconsistent nature of English spelling remain valid, and efforts at spelling reform often cite Franklin's work as an important precursor. He contributed to the understanding of lead poisoning, observing that painters and typesetters who worked with lead compounds often suffered from colic, paralysis, and other symptoms. As a printer who had worked with lead type for decades, Franklin knew the industry well and recognized the pattern. His observations helped establish the connection between lead exposure and these debilitating conditions, though a full understanding of lead poisoning would not be achieved until much later. What united all these diverse investigations was Franklin's fundamental belief that knowledge should be useful, that understanding the world was not an end in itself but a means to improving human life. He was the embodiment of the Enlightenment ideal of the practical philosopher, the person who combined theoretical understanding with practical application, who moved seamlessly between abstract thought and concrete invention, who asked not just, "How does this work?" but, "How can this be better?" His approach to science was remarkably modern in many ways. He formed hypotheses and tested them through experiment. He sought natural explanations for phenomena rather than supernatural ones. He measured and quantified whenever possible. He shared his findings openly, corresponding with other scientists throughout Europe and America, publishing his results, encouraging others to replicate and extend his work. He understood that science is a collective enterprise, that knowledge builds on knowledge, that today's discovery enables tomorrow's breakthrough. Yet he never became narrow or specialized, never restricted himself to a single field or domain. His curiosity was omnivorous, his interest universal. He could discuss philosophy with equal facility, could write on politics or morality or human nature, could turn his hand to diplomacy or business or civic organization with the same confidence and competence he brought to scientific investigation. He was, in the old sense of the term, a true philosopher, a lover of wisdom in all its forms. Picture Franklin in his various workshops and laboratories, in his print shop surrounded by type and paper and the smell of ink, in his electrical laboratory with its mysterious apparatus and glass tubes and brass spheres, in his study with its walls lined with books and its writing desk covered with papers, in his workshop with tools and materials for his latest invention, in the streets of Philadelphia organizing his fellow citizens for the common good. Each of these Franklin was the same man, the curious investigator, the practical improver, the servant of humanity. His fame as a natural philosopher spread throughout the learned world. He was elected to the Royal Society of London in 1756, one of the highest honors for a scientist. Universities on both sides of the Atlantic awarded him honorary degrees: St. Andrews in Scotland, Oxford and Edinburgh, William and Mary, and Harvard. He corresponded with the leading scientists of Europe: the great Swedish naturalist Linnaeus, the chemist Joseph Priestley who discovered oxygen, the French naturalist Buffon, the Italian physicist Volta, and many others. Poor Richard, the fictional almanac maker, had become Dr. Franklin, the real scientist, self-taught, from the colonies, accepted as an equal by the greatest minds of the age. A man with less than 2 years of formal education made fundamental contributions to human knowledge, proving that genius is not the province of the formally educated elite but can emerge anywhere there is curiosity, discipline, and the freedom to pursue truth. But even as Franklin was achieving fame as a scientist, events were pulling him toward a different arena, one where his talents would be tested in new ways. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies was becoming strained, and Franklin would find himself caught between the land of his birth and the empire to which it belonged. Benjamin Franklin loved Britain. This is important to understand. Unlike many of the men who would later lead the American Revolution, Franklin did not start from a position of opposition to British rule. He considered himself a loyal subject of the Crown, proud to be part of the British Empire, the greatest empire the world had known since Rome. In 1757 he traveled to London as an agent for the Pennsylvania Assembly, tasked with resolving disputes between the colony and the proprietors, the Penn family who owned Pennsylvania and whose representatives were in conflict with the elected assembly over taxation and governance. Franklin was 51 years old at the height of his fame, and London welcomed him. He was already known there as the man who had unlocked the mystery of lightning, the Colonial who had been elected to the Royal Society, the self-taught philosopher who corresponded with the learned men of Europe. London society was curious about this American, and Franklin was delighted to be in the center of the world's greatest city. Picture him in London, dining with nobility, debating with members of Parliament, visiting the Royal Society, attending concerts, exploring bookshops, soaking up culture and conversation. He lived in comfortable lodgings at Craven Street with a landlady, Mrs. Stevenson, who became like family to him. He traveled to Scotland and was awarded an honorary doctorate from St. Andrews University, becoming Dr. Franklin, a title he would carry for the rest of his life. He remained in London until 1762, returned briefly to Philadelphia, then went back to London in 1764, this time as an agent not just for Pennsylvania but eventually for Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts as well. He would remain in London for most of the next decade, becoming more British in his manners, perhaps, even as the gulf between Britain and America widened. The problem was simple in outline, fiendishly complex in detail. Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in America, expelling France from North America. This was an expensive victory, and Britain had debts to pay and an empire to defend. The British government believed, reasonably from their perspective, that the American colonies should contribute to the cost of their own defense. The Americans believed, equally reasonably from their perspective, that they had contributed enormously to the war effort, and that they were already taxed by their own colonial assemblies. The principle of British liberty, as they understood it, was that free men could not be taxed without their consent, expressed through their elected representatives. The British Parliament passed a series of acts to raise revenue from the colonies: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Each sparked protest in America. Each brought the constitutional question into sharper focus. Did Parliament have the right to tax the colonies, or did that right belong exclusively to the colonial assemblies? Franklin, caught between the two sides, tried to serve as a mediator, a bridge between Britain and America. He believed that the empire could be preserved if both sides would be reasonable, if Britain would acknowledge American rights and Americans would acknowledge British authority. In 1766 he was called to testify before Parliament about the Stamp Act, which had sparked riots and resistance throughout the colonies. His testimony was masterful, a display of his gifts as a communicator and persuader. For 4 hours he answered questions explaining American grievances, making clear that the colonists distinguished between internal taxes, like the Stamp Act, which they rejected, and external taxes, like customs duties, which they accepted, and warning that attempting to collect the Stamp Act by force would have dire consequences. His testimony helped convince Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, a victory for both Franklin and the cause of colonial rights. But the underlying question remained unresolved, and the British government continued to assert its right to tax the colonies as it saw fit. Franklin's dilemma was profound. He was a man of divided loyalties, genuinely attached to Britain but increasingly committed to American rights. He was approaching 70 years old, an age when most men of his era would be contemplating a peaceful retirement. Instead, he was about to be thrust into the greatest crisis of his life. In 1772, Franklin obtained letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, to officials in Britain. These letters suggested that American liberties might need to be curtailed to maintain order in the colonies. Franklin sent the letters to America, where they were published and caused outrage, confirming American suspicions that British officials were plotting against their freedoms. When it was discovered that Franklin had leaked the letters, he was called before the Privy Council in January 1774. There, in what became known as the cockpit, because it had once been used for cockfighting, Franklin was subjected to a brutal verbal assault by Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General. For an hour, Wedderburn denounced Franklin as a thief and a liar, accused him of fomenting rebellion, heaped insult upon insult, while Franklin stood silent, his face betraying no emotion. The assembled lords and officials laughed at Wedderburn's wit. Franklin's friends were shocked and horrified. And Franklin himself, standing there in his best suit of Manchester velvet, being ridiculed by a man he considered his inferior, felt something shift inside him. He had come to London as a mediator, hoping to preserve the empire. He left the cockpit as a revolutionary, convinced that reconciliation was impossible. Picture this scene. An old man, dignified in his humiliation, standing silently while hatred washes over him, making his calculations, reaching his conclusions. Franklin would later say that he wore the same Manchester velvet suit when he signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War and establishing American independence. It was his private revenge, his way of marking the journey from humiliation to triumph. He returned to America in March 1775, just as the conflict between Britain and the colonies was erupting into open warfare. Lexington and Concord had been fought while he was crossing the Atlantic. By the time he arrived in Philadelphia, the revolution had begun. At 69 years old, Benjamin Franklin might have been forgiven for sitting out the revolution, for seeking safety and comfort in his declining years. Instead, he threw himself into the cause of independence with the same energy he had once devoted to electrical experiments and civic improvements. He was immediately elected to the Continental Congress, where his fame, his experience, and his abilities made him invaluable. He served on committees, drafted proposals, advised on strategy. When Congress decided to send a delegation to Canada to try to bring Quebec into the rebellion, Franklin went, despite his age and the rigors of winter travel. The mission failed, but Franklin's willingness to undertake it demonstrated his commitment. In June of 1776, he was appointed to the committee tasked with drafting a Declaration of Independence. The Committee of Five included John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, but the actual writing fell primarily to Jefferson, the youngest member, known for his felicity with words. Jefferson's draft was brilliant, but Franklin made it better. When Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," Franklin changed it to "We hold these truths to be self-evident," a phrase that echoes through history with the force of logic rather than the language of religion. Sacred truths might be denied by non-believers. Self-evident truths command universal assent by the light of reason alone. The Declaration of Independence was approved on July 2 and officially adopted on July 4, 1776. Franklin signed it, knowing that he was committing treason against the crown, that if the revolution failed, he would likely hang. He was the oldest signer, and according to legend, when someone worried aloud that they must all hang together, Franklin replied, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." But signing the declaration was the easy part. Winning the war would require money, weapons, allies, and the 13 colonies had none of these in sufficient quantity. Britain was the greatest military and naval power in the world. America was a confederation of argumentative colonies with a ragtag army and an empty treasury. Without foreign aid, the cause was hopeless. And so, in October 1776, Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to France as a commissioner, tasked with securing French support for the American cause. He was 70 years old, suffering from gout, undertaking a dangerous Atlantic crossing in winter, going to a country whose language he barely spoke, to persuade an absolute monarchy to support a democratic revolution. It was perhaps the most important diplomatic mission in American history, and Franklin was the perfect man for it. We cross the Atlantic now, to the court of Louis XVI at Versailles, to the salons of Paris, to a world of powder and silk and elaborate ceremony. Franklin arrived in France in December 1776 and quickly realized that his fame as a scientist had preceded him. The French knew him as the man who had tamed lightning, the philosophe from the wilderness, the embodiment of natural virtue and Enlightenment reason. He became almost immediately a celebrity. The French were enchanted by him. His plain brown clothing, his fur cap, his simple manners, all seemed to confirm their romantic ideas about America as a land of natural liberty and republican virtue. Ladies of the court clamored for his attention. His image appeared on medallions, snuff-boxes, rings and prints. He was invited to salons, where the wittiest and most intellectual members of French society gathered to discuss philosophy, politics, and art. Franklin played his role to perfection. He understood that he was not just a diplomat but a symbol, representing America to France, and he dressed and behaved in ways that reinforced the image the French wanted to see. The fur cap, which became his trademark, was not American at all but was bought in France, but it looked American, and that was what mattered. But beneath the celebrity and the salons, Franklin was engaged in deadly serious work. France was interested in the American rebellion primarily as a way to weaken Britain, its traditional enemy. But France was cautious. It would not openly support America without assurance that the Americans could actually win, and it would not risk war with Britain unless it was confident of success. Franklin had to convince the French that America was worth supporting, that the revolution would succeed, that French aid would not be wasted. He had to negotiate treaties of alliance and commerce, secure loans and military supplies, manage the complex relationship between America and France, all while dealing with his fellow commissioners, who often disagreed with him, and with Congress, which sent contradictory instructions across an ocean that took months to cross. He succeeded through a combination of patience, charm, strategic thinking, and sheer persistence. He understood the French court, adapted to its ways, made himself indispensable. When the news arrived of the American victory at Saratoga in October 1777, Franklin seized the moment. He let it be known that Britain was making peace overtures to America, suggesting that if France did not act soon, it might lose its opportunity to weaken Britain and gain a valuable ally. In February 1778, France signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States, recognizing American independence and committing to support the war effort. It was a diplomatic triumph, arguably the most important achievement of Franklin's life. Without French aid, the money, the weapons, the naval support, the thousands of French soldiers who would fight alongside Americans, the revolution would almost certainly have failed. Picture Franklin in Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors, surrounded by the splendor of Louis XVI's court, signing the treaties that would secure American independence. He was 72 years old, a printer's apprentice from Boston, standing as an equal among princes and nobles, representing a nation that did not yet quite exist, making it real through the force of his personality and skill. He remained in France for 9 years, through the rest of the war and the peace negotiations that followed. He lived in Passy, a village outside Paris, in a house lent to him by a wealthy supporter. He maintained his electrical experiments, corresponded with scientists throughout Europe, played chess, flirted with the ladies, enjoyed the cultural riches of Paris, and all the while conducted the business of the United States with patience and shrewdness. When the war ended with the British surrender at Yorktown in October 1781, Franklin was appointed to the commission that would negotiate the peace treaty. Along with John Adams and John Jay, he conducted months of delicate negotiations with British representatives, maneuvering between British interests, French interests, Spanish interests, and American interests, all of which conflicted in various ways. The resulting Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, was a masterpiece of diplomacy. Britain recognized American independence and granted the new nation territory extending west to the Mississippi River, far more than the Americans had controlled during the war. It was a spectacular achievement, secured in part through Franklin's willingness to negotiate separately with Britain, partly circumventing the French, a move that risked French anger but gained American advantage. Franklin's achievement was extraordinary. He was not a trained diplomat. He had no background in international relations. He was a tradesman, a scientist, a writer. But he understood people, understood negotiation, understood how to achieve goals through patience and persistence. And in doing so, he helped secure the independence of a nation. In 1785, at 79 years old, Franklin finally returned to America, arriving in Philadelphia to a hero's welcome. He had been abroad for more than a decade, and the nation he returned to was transformed. The United States was no longer a dream or a rebellion but an actual country, recognized by the powers of Europe, struggling to define itself and establish its government. Franklin might have retired then. Surely he had earned rest. But there was one more great service he would render to his country. In May 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island refused to participate, gathered in Philadelphia for a convention officially called to revise the Articles of Confederation, the loose framework of government under which the United States had operated since independence. The Articles had proven inadequate to the task of governing a nation. They created no executive, no judiciary, no power to tax or regulate commerce. Each state retained its sovereignty, and unanimous consent was required for any amendment. The result was paralysis, debt, and the looming threat of the Union falling apart. Franklin, at 81, was by far the oldest delegate. He was in constant pain from kidney stones and gout, his body failing even as his mind remained sharp. He was so infirm that he had to be carried to the State House in a sedan chair borne by prisoners from the Walnut Street Jail, who would gently lift him and carry him through the streets each morning and return him home each evening. But his presence gave weight to the proceedings. The convention met in the same room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, presided, lending his immense prestige to the gathering. But Franklin's presence was equally important, a living connection to the founding of the nation, the oldest signer of the Declaration participating now in the creation of a more perfect union. The convention, meeting in secret with guards at the doors and windows closed despite the summer heat, quickly abandoned the idea of merely revising the Articles and instead decided to write an entirely new constitution, creating a much stronger federal government with powers to tax, regulate commerce, and enforce laws directly on individuals rather than working through the states. The debates were often contentious, sometimes bitter. Large states and small states disagreed about representation in the new legislature. The large states, led by Virginia, wanted representation based on population, which would give them more power. The small states, led by New Jersey, wanted equal representation for each state, as under the Articles. Neither side would budge, and the convention seemed on the verge of collapse. Franklin proposed a compromise: create a legislature with two houses. In one house, the House of Representatives, seats would be allocated based on population, satisfying the large states. In the other house, the Senate, each state would have equal representation regardless of size, satisfying the small states. This Great Compromise, or Connecticut Compromise as it came to be called, since Roger Sherman of Connecticut also advocated for it, broke the deadlock and allowed the convention to move forward. But other disputes remained. Northern states and southern states disagreed about slavery, particularly about whether enslaved people should be counted for purposes of representation and taxation. The result was the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted each enslaved person as three-fifths of a free person for both purposes. It was a moral horror, a compromise with evil, but it was the price of union. Franklin, by then a committed abolitionist, swallowed his objections and supported the Constitution despite this provision, believing that a united nation had a better chance of eventually abolishing slavery than separate, quarreling states. There were disputes about the powers of the president. Some delegates feared creating another king, another tyrant like George III. Others believed a strong executive was necessary for effective government. They argued over the president's term of office, over whether he should be elected by the people or by the legislature, over whether he could be impeached and for what offenses, over his power to make treaties and appoint judges. They argued about the structure of the judiciary, about whether there should be federal courts below the Supreme Court, about how judges should be appointed and for how long they should serve. They argued about the relationship between federal and state governments, about the enumeration of powers, about what should be left to the states and what should be controlled by the federal government. Through all these debates, Franklin played the role of mediator and conciliator. He was too old and too infirm to dominate the proceedings, but his interventions were carefully chosen and often decisive. When tempers flared, he would tell a story or make a joke, diffusing tension. When compromise seemed impossible, he would propose a middle path, finding common ground between opposing positions. When delegates seemed ready to give up and go home, he would remind them of what was at stake, of the historic nature of their task, of their responsibility to posterity. On the final day of the convention, September 17, 1787, Franklin gave a speech, though he was too weak to deliver it himself and had it read by a colleague. In it, he acknowledged that the Constitution was not perfect, that he himself had doubts about some parts of it. But he urged all delegates to sign it anyway because an imperfect constitution was better than no constitution, because the country needed a government, and because the longer they deliberated, the less likely they were to agree on anything. I confess that there are several parts of this constitution which I do not at present approve, his speech read, but I am not sure I shall never approve them, for having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration, to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. This was Franklin's final gift to his country: the wisdom of humility, the recognition that certainty is often the enemy of progress, that compromise is not weakness but the essential art of self-government. 39 delegates signed the Constitution that day. Franklin, despite his doubts, was one of them. He was the only founding father to sign all four of the founding documents of the United States: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris ending the Revolutionary War, and the Constitution. No other individual participated so fully in the creation of the American nation. Let us move into the final chapter of Franklin's life, a quiet coda after decades of achievement. Franklin spent his last years in Philadelphia, in the house on Market Street where he had lived before his years in France. He was in constant pain, barely able to move, confined largely to his bed. But he remained intellectually active, corresponding with friends, writing his autobiography, receiving visitors from around the world who wanted to meet the famous Dr. Franklin. He also became increasingly vocal in his opposition to slavery, a profound evolution for a man who had once owned slaves himself. In his final public act, just months before his death, he signed a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery, arguing that it was inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution. He was president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and he used his remaining influence to advance the cause. This transformation reveals something essential about Franklin's character: his willingness to change his mind, to admit he had been wrong, to evolve. He was not trapped by his past positions or his earlier prejudices. He remained open to persuasion, to new evidence, to moral growth. In an age when many men became more rigid with age, Franklin became more flexible, more willing to question his own assumptions. On April 17, 1790, surrounded by family, Benjamin Franklin died. He was 84 years old. His death was mourned throughout America and Europe. In France, the National Assembly declared 3 days of mourning, an honor usually reserved for heads of state. In America, 20,000 people attended his funeral, the largest gathering Philadelphia had ever seen. He left behind an estate of about $150,000, substantial but not enormous, much of it dedicated to public purposes. He left £1,000 each to Boston and Philadelphia to be held in trust for 200 years, accruing interest, to be used for public improvements. This characteristically long-term thinking reflected Franklin's belief that each generation should benefit the next, that wealth should serve the public good. But his real legacy was not measured in money. It was measured in institutions: libraries, universities, hospitals, fire departments, learned societies. It was measured in inventions that made life safer and more comfortable. It was measured in the nation he helped create, in the principles of self-government and individual liberty that he championed. It was measured in the example he set of constant self-improvement, of curiosity, of civic engagement, of service to others. Benjamin Franklin has been dead for more than 2 centuries, but his presence remains powerful in American culture. His face on the $100 bill is probably more familiar to most Americans than the faces of presidents on other currency. His aphorisms, drawn from Poor Richard's Almanac, are still quoted, often by people who have no idea of their origin. "A penny saved is a penny earned. Early to bed and early to rise." These phrases have outlived their creator by generations, embedded in the language itself. But who was Benjamin Franklin really? This is a question that has puzzled historians and biographers, because Franklin was such a complicated figure, full of contradictions and complexity. He was a man who preached virtue but had an illegitimate son. He was a family man who spent decades away from his wife. He was a champion of liberty who owned slaves. He was a Democrat who loved the company of aristocrats. He was an American patriot who spent much of his life in Europe. Perhaps the key to understanding Franklin is to recognize that he was always inventing himself, always becoming something new. The printer's apprentice became the successful businessman. The businessman became the scientist. The scientist became the diplomat. The diplomat became the revolutionary. Each transformation built on what came before, but each was also a new creation. Franklin understood that identity is not fixed but fluid, that we can remake ourselves through conscious effort and will. This is perhaps his most American quality, this belief in self-invention, in the possibility of transformation. In Europe, identity was largely determined by birth. You were born into a class, a station, a role, and you remained there. But in America, or at least in the American dream that Franklin helped articulate, you could be born poor and die rich, born ignorant and die learned, born obscure and die famous. Of course, this dream was not available to everyone in Franklin's America. It was not available to the enslaved Africans whose labor built much of the colonial economy. It was not fully available to women, whose opportunities were severely limited. It was not available to Native Americans who were being displaced from their lands. The promise of American opportunity has always been more restricted in practice than in theory. But Franklin's life did demonstrate that remarkable transformation was possible, and his example has inspired countless Americans to believe that they too can rise through effort and ability. The self-made man, the American dream, these concepts are inseparable from the story of Benjamin Franklin. Picture the streets of Philadelphia, the city that Franklin made and that made him. The colonial city he first entered as a penniless runaway, compare it to the young nation's capital where he spent his final years. The library he founded, still serving readers. The university he helped establish, still educating students. The hospital, the fire company, all the institutions he created that continue their work. Franklin believed in practical benevolence, in doing good in the world through tangible action. He was not much interested in abstract philosophy for its own sake. He wanted knowledge that could be used, virtue that could be practiced, institutions that could serve. This pragmatic bent, this focus on utility and improvement, became characteristically American, part of the national character that Franklin helped shape. His scientific work, too, left a lasting legacy. The lightning rod saved countless buildings and lives. The understanding of electricity that he advanced became the foundation for technologies that would transform the world. When you turn on a light, use a computer, charge your phone, you are using applications of electrical principles that Franklin helped discover. But perhaps his greatest legacy is harder to quantify. It is the example of a life dedicated to learning, to improvement, to service. Franklin showed that a curious mind and a strong will could achieve extraordinary things, that formal education was no substitute for self-education, that genius could emerge from unexpected places. He also showed the importance of humility and good humor. Despite his many achievements, Franklin never took himself too seriously. He could laugh at his own failings, acknowledge his mistakes, maintain perspective about his place in the world. His autobiography, written in his later years, is full of self-deprecating humor, admissions of error, gentle mockery of his younger self. This humility, combined with genuine achievement, made him appealing to his contemporaries and continues to make him appealing to us. There is Benjamin Franklin in his print shop, ink on his hands, setting type for the Pennsylvania Gazette. There he is in his laboratory, drawing sparks from his electrical apparatus, trying to understand this mysterious force. There he is at Versailles, in his fur cap and plain brown suit, charming the court of Louis XVI. There he is in the State House in Philadelphia, signing the Constitution, helping to create a new form of government. And there he is at the end, an old man in bed, writing letters, receiving visitors, looking back over a long life of achievement and adventure, preparing for what comes to us all. He faced death as he had faced life, with courage and curiosity. When asked about his religious beliefs in his final illness, he said that he believed in God and expected divine mercy, but that he had some doubts and he would know the truth soon enough. No portrait of Benjamin Franklin would be complete without acknowledging his contradictions, the ways in which he failed to live up to his own ideals. For a man who systematically pursued virtue, he was remarkably willing to compromise his principles when it suited his purposes. Take his relationship with slavery. Franklin owned enslaved people for much of his adult life. In his newspaper he published advertisements for slave sales. He used enslaved labor in his household and his business. This was not unusual for a man of his time and class, but it was still a profound moral failure, a participation in one of history's great evils. What makes this more complex is that Franklin evolved on this issue. In his later years he became increasingly critical of slavery, eventually becoming president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. He wrote satirical essays mocking the arguments used to defend slavery. In one of his last public acts, as we have mentioned, he petitioned Congress for abolition. This evolution from slaveholder to abolitionist reflects Franklin's capacity for moral growth, but it does not erase his earlier participation in the system. We can acknowledge both the transformation and the original sin, holding both truths together in tension. Similarly, Franklin's personal life was complicated. He had an illegitimate son, William, whose mother was never identified. He took William into his household and raised him as his own, but the circumstances of William's birth remained a source of speculation and scandal. Later, when William remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution while Franklin sided with the Patriots, the two became estranged, a breach that was never fully healed. Franklin's marriage to Deborah was long but troubled. They spent years apart, particularly during his long stays in London and Paris. Deborah refused to cross the ocean, fearing shipwreck, so she remained in Philadelphia while Franklin lived in Europe. When she died in 1774, Franklin was in London and had not seen her for a decade. In his letters he expressed grief, but he had chosen career and adventure over companionship, a choice that left Deborah lonely and unhappy. In Paris, Franklin enjoyed the company of sophisticated French women, carrying on flirtatious correspondences and possibly romantic relationships, even as his wife languished in Philadelphia and later died there. He was in his 70s and 80s by then, but still charming, still seeking admiration and affection. These personal failings remind us that Franklin was human, not a plaster saint. He had appetites and ambitions that sometimes conflicted with his stated principles. He could be calculating and self-serving, managing his public image carefully, always aware of how his actions would be perceived. Yet even these flaws tell us something important about Franklin and about the American character he helped shape. Americans have always been willing to forgive personal imperfection in their heroes if those heroes achieve great things and remain relatable. Franklin's faults make him more human, more accessible, more like us. A perfect Franklin would be less interesting, less believable, less inspiring. What can we learn from Benjamin Franklin's life? What lessons does his long journey from poverty to prominence, from Boston to Paris, from apprentice to founding father, offer to us? First, there is the lesson of self-education. Franklin had less than 2 years of formal schooling, yet he became one of the most learned men of his age. He did this through reading, through conversation, through experimentation, through thinking deeply about what he encountered. In an age of online courses and endless information at our fingertips, Franklin's example reminds us that education is not something done to us but something we do for ourselves. Second, there is the lesson of practical benevolence. Franklin did not just think about how to improve society, he actually organized the institutions to do it. Libraries, fire companies, hospitals, learned societies, these were not inevitable developments but the result of specific people, starting with Franklin, deciding to create them. His example challenges us to ask, what institutions does our community need and how can we help create them? Third, there is the lesson of long-term thinking. Franklin's bequest to Boston and Philadelphia, to be held in trust for 200 years, reflects his understanding that our actions ripple forward in time, affecting generations we will never meet. In an age of quarterly earnings reports and daily news cycles, Franklin's century-spanning vision offers a corrective, a reminder to think about legacy and lasting impact. Fourth, there is the lesson of intellectual humility. Franklin's willingness to admit error, to change his mind, to acknowledge the limits of his knowledge, is remarkable. In his speech at the end of the Constitutional Convention, he says explicitly that he has been wrong before and may be wrong now. This humility did not weaken his effectiveness. It strengthened it, making others more willing to work with him, to trust his judgment, to accept his compromises. Fifth, there is the lesson of reinvention. Franklin did not remain a printer, though he could have. He did not remain a scientist, though his discoveries alone would have secured his fame. He continually moved into new fields, learned new skills, took on new challenges. At an age when most of his contemporaries were dead or declining, he was negotiating treaties in Paris, helping write the Constitution, campaigning for abolition. His life reminds us that it is never too late to begin something new, to develop in unexpected directions. Sixth, there is the lesson of civic engagement. Franklin believed that private individuals had a responsibility to contribute to the public good, that citizenship was not passive but active. He served on committees, organized clubs, wrote proposals, mobilized others. Democracy, in Franklin's understanding, required constant effort from ordinary citizens, not just voting but participating, organizing, improving. These lessons remain relevant, perhaps more relevant than ever in our own complicated time. We face challenges that Franklin could never have imagined: climate change and artificial intelligence and global pandemics, but the fundamental questions remain the same. How do we educate ourselves? How do we improve our communities? How do we balance self-interest and public good? How do we govern ourselves wisely? How do we remain humble and open to new information while still acting decisively? Franklin does not provide easy answers to these questions, but his life demonstrates that they can be engaged seriously, that individuals can make a difference, that practical wisdom is possible. We return now to where we began, to that house on Milk Street in Boston, to that cold January day in 1706 when a baby cried and Josiah Franklin welcomed his 15th child into the world. Could that candlemaker have imagined what his son would become? Could anyone watching young Benjamin run away from Boston, arriving in Philadelphia with 3 puffy rolls and empty pockets, have predicted his future? Could the members of Parliament who laughed at Franklin's humiliation in the cockpit have foreseen that he would outlast the British Empire in America, that the nation he helped create would one day dwarf Britain in power and influence? The future is opaque to us as it was to them. We cannot know which of today's children will change the world, which ordinary lives will prove extraordinary, which unpromising beginnings will lead to remarkable endings. And this, perhaps, is why Franklin's story continues to inspire. It suggests that greatness can emerge from anywhere, that the accidents of birth do not determine the achievements of life, that transformation is possible. Benjamin Franklin died more than 200 years ago, but he remains present in American life, in the institutions he founded, in the nation he helped create, in the values he articulated, in the example he set. Every time we check out a book from a library, every time we call the fire department, every time we turn on a light, we are living in the world that Franklin helped make. But more than that, we are living with the question that Franklin's life poses to each of us. What will we make of ourselves? What will we contribute? How will we improve the world we inhabit? How will we educate ourselves, serve our communities, pursue truth, balance our various loyalties and commitments? These are not easy questions, and Franklin's answers will not necessarily be ours. We live in a different time, face different challenges, hold different values in some respects. But the example of a life lived fully, curiously, generously, a life of constant learning and striving and serving, that example remains powerful. Let Benjamin Franklin fade into history, but let his spirit remain. The spirit of curiosity, of improvement, of benevolence, of humility, of civic engagement, of practical wisdom. These are gifts he left us, more valuable than any monetary bequest, more enduring than any physical monument. We have traveled far, across centuries, through a remarkable life. Tomorrow we will return to our own time, our own concerns. But perhaps we will carry something of Franklin's example with us, some spark of inspiration, some reminder that each life is an opportunity to learn, to grow, to contribute, to matter. Benjamin Franklin, the printer's apprentice who became the first American, would be pleased to know that his story still has the power to engage and inspire. He believed in useful knowledge, in practical benefit, and what could be more useful than a life examined, learned from, appreciated across the gulf of time? History is not just the story of great people doing great things, but the story of how ordinary people, through effort and will and circumstance, sometimes achieve the extraordinary. The work of one life is complete. But the work continues, passed from generation to generation, each of us adding our small contribution to the great project of human improvement that Franklin championed. Perhaps we will see the world a little differently, with Franklin's curious eyes asking, "What can I learn today? How can I help? What can I create? How can I grow?" These questions echo across the centuries, from that January morning in Boston to this moment, connecting us all in the long chain of human striving and wondering and becoming. And if you found value in this journey through Benjamin Franklin's extraordinary life, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories from history. We are all works in progress, always learning, always growing, always becoming something new.